In this video, we're going to be going through poses that are designed to target the glute and create that opening through single leg poses. Now, these are poses like figure 4, thread the needle on the back and from standing as well, pigeon pose, tree pose, twisted lunge, side lunge, and eagle pose as well. Now, as we go through these poses, we're going to be looking at hands-free versions of these, but not only hands-free, more resistance-based versions of these, more active, dynamic versions of these, so that not only are we encouraging our students to utilize the areas of the body, and in this case, inner thigh, hip flexor, a little bit of core sometimes, to help the glute willingly lengthen, but also we're utilizing the strength of the glute, and we are considering the body as a holistic unit, knowing that strengthening and lengthening, they happen together. They happen as a holistic action and holistic result of doing movement that is more action-based and not so much stretching. Now, before we get into the typical pigeon, we're just going to look at sometimes what's called deer pose or single leg or half pigeon. And again, when we get into this position, when we look at the angle, my torso is here, my leg is here. Would I be able to achieve this position had I not been sitting up, right? The floor is holding my leg. If I were to lean back, then that's going to be different. But as soon as I sit up, am I able to get that same angle just from a standing position? Likely not. So already I'm utilizing force to create flexibility. Now, when we look at some of these different techniques that we've explored, which is to go hands-free or create resistance, this is just going to give you a little preview of that. So we're not focusing on this back leg, we're just focusing on this front leg here. Now we've got the external rotation going on, and then maybe you've got some of your students who want to just come down and relax. When I do that, I'm like, oh yeah, I can feel that stretch. But as we know, the sensation of stretch does not need to occur in order for there to be lengthening. And quite oftentimes, what ends up happening is the sensation, the receptors that sense the stretch, they become very desensitized. And so a lot of times we end up chasing the stretch. And this happens even for yoga students who do not appear to be very flexible. They end up chasing it because the body has not actually been very supported via muscular co-contraction to naturally lengthen the tissues. So a lot of times, again, the sensation of stretch, it might be there, it might not, but it doesn't need to be, and it doesn't necessarily only mean that those students who are super flexible are the ones that are at risk. We're looking at everyone here because we're looking at the body as a holistic unit. So when your students come forward, and if they do come all the way down, again, would they be able to lie on their back and get that same position? This is my max. That's where I can go. I cannot go any further utilizing, again, my inner thigh strength or my hip flexor strength here. That's it. I can't go any further. So where I am on the floor is here, okay? Shows the blind spot. Shows just how much force we use to get into these positions. So what we're going to do is enter into a hands-free and also a little bit of a resistance. So we're going to actually push, get your students to push that leg down. Then from there, they can perhaps lean forward a little bit. Now, I really want to caution you with this type of thing because this angle that I'm utilizing here is not a stable angle at all. So if you're going to get your students to push down and also maybe slightly come forward, I would get them to draw this in, then push down, and then start to come forward in some capacity. Even then, not a super stable angle. So if anything, just getting them to push down is really effective. But I would say in general, this pose, I know sometimes we use it instead of pigeon. It's not actually as great as we might think it is because it utilizes a lot of force to create flexibility. Now, this leads us into doing pigeon pose, right? Pigeon pose where we are going to actually lift the body up. And that is actually the benefit of doing pigeon pose over something like this because we can lift the body up. Whereas this, it's really not that easy to come into a more elevated position. So that's why pigeon pose would be more of my choice as opposed to doing something like this. However, I did want to share with you one little mobility thing that you can do for your students, which will give more automatic activation and muscular co-contraction to support the opening of the glute. And this is not only targeting just this one glute, but it's also going to be targeting this one as well. So in a sense, it can come into more of the double leg stuff, which we'll do later, leading into something like fire log or our cow face. But this is just a little bit of a fun one. So you're going to get your students to turn and twist, and they can use the arms just to come into an open kind of twist here. And little fun bit, they can also lift that leg if they wanted to. Then they're going to open that up, move it through, twist the other way, and tap. So then we've got this working as well. And there's a squeeze between the thighs, yes? So we've got the squeeze, we've got the activation here, then we've got the core on top of it, which helps to create that movement. Then we move it around, maybe knee is down, foot is up, and twist. Now I know for some students this action is a little bit too much into the lower back, so that doesn't need to happen, and it can be a lean, but again, be mindful that if the hand is down and there's a lean, then there's not this like force that's going on. The other thing you can do is get your students up on a bolster, and that makes it a little bit more accessible. So there's a twist, and then there is a tap and twist, and lean and twist, and tap and twist. So that's just one little thing that you can do with that half pigeon or that deer pose, using some of that movement to be able to create a little bit more of a supportive nature with the body. So getting into pigeon, I don't want to spend too much time here because we've already looked at this through the back leg, and it's really just the same thing through the front leg, yeah? Pressing down and lifting up. So we are going to feel in that glute, which is the target area that we want to stretch, that there's the activation. So you might have some of your students kind of going, oh, but how is that stretching? Because I can feel it, it's actually tightening up. Again, the body works with this harmony between strength and flexibility. So that's something that you can share with them, coupled with the fact that if you got them to lie down on their back and try to create the same angle that a forceful pigeon creates in their body, they wouldn't be able to achieve that. So pressing down and lifting up gives the lengthening of those tissues, as well as creates the strengthening plus the co-activation to be able to support the body in creating a pigeon pose that is more accessible, because it can be practiced for longer. Use the blocks, get the body, get the knees all cushioned up, and that active dynamic pigeon can also be utilized with a little bit of pulsing, movement in the upper body. Maybe there's a little bit of a twist, as we've established. The twist and that natural activation of the core that happens to make the twist can help to create, I call this a feedback loop, a feedback system where that activates a little bit more to cross the midline over, helping the glute find that spaciousness that your students might be looking for. We're going to look at thread the needle next. Now again, a pose that involves lots of force. Case in point, just this position. Yes, for me, if I were to maintain that, yeah, then I have to create the activation to hold it, but look at how much further I can go when I force it. There's my blind spot. This is what I can do on my own, and this is what I can do when I force my body. So we, again, just take a hands-free approach, which is we're not pulling at all, but this is not only a hands-free approach, we're removing layers of force. So what we do instead is we just encourage our students to lift the leg off the thigh and slightly cross the midline. It's the same action that we've been doing this whole time. Now, there are a couple of different layers to this that you can get your students to work on, and as I've said before, play around with pulses, play around with squeezing and crossing even more, play around with drawing the heel to the outside of the leg and then drawing it back, play around with lowering it down, lifting it up. We did all this in the basic preparations. You can go to internal rotation, external rotation, crossing over, all of these things, and then that doesn't even include anything that's happening with the upper body. So from here, I'll just, as a side note, let you know that if you find that one of your students is not able to lift the leg off the thigh and they're like this, then they need to lengthen that leg out a little bit more to find their range. Then from here, you can get them to go into more of a resistance-based stretch. So the heel would come towards the outside of the ankle, and then you would get your students to press the foot into the knee and the knee into the foot. Now, as I mentioned when we did that deer pose or that half pigeon, this isn't the most stable position for the hip. So it's really important to be mindful of these things, and you might even get that to go down perhaps a little bit lower and just not force it. Back off on some of the range a little bit. So there can be that force. Now again, you can use this to lead into, okay, now if you want to pull and come into more force, you can. Pull, 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 do the thing that you want to do. But when you get your students to release, get them to come out of it with a stabilizing approach. So it's hands-free release, push, ankle into thigh, thigh back into ankle. Breathe. Keep this right leg where it is as much as you can, and release. Haha, the left leg down. Squeeze maybe a few times, heel in, cross, and then we can shake that out and let that come down. So there's a few different things that you can do there on the back to help your students move into some of that figure 4 glute opening focused pose. I wanted to quickly look at eagle pose because this is a very forceful way to create that opening into the glute. Now that might not be the main component, but one of the focal points of eagle pose is the hip joints as we lower down and we sit down. And yes, there is strength involved. However, wrapping the foot has a lot of force. So you can utilize the exact same thing that we have been doing, which I showed in the preparatory basic preparations, is going into that dropped down position first, and then the foot can externally rotate first, or in this situation I actually like to draw the knee up first, then into external rotation, then into squeezing the thighs together. Now this aspect can actually be more advantageous than wrapping the foot around, which is forcing the flexibility. So we can keep instructing our students to squeeze, and we can even draw that in and then squeeze and draw it out. And that can be a modification for eagle pose, and it can also be a preparation and a way to just bring a little bit more variety into your classes, more diversity, give more context to your students, and really help them to understand what it is that they're doing, why they're doing it, and how they can invite their bodies into that pose. When it comes to something like a tree pose, a lot of these same things apply, and I'm going a little bit faster through these things because you'll start to see how we just keep repeating the same things over and over again. Now with tree pose, if we're going to go hands-free, which means we're not resting the foot on the thigh, then we would essentially just hold. And you see how I have a little gap here? Hold that there. Either point the toes onto the leg like this, or do the heel onto the leg like this, or cross around the front, which again can lead into something like a standing figure 4 pose where we keep that hovered position. So all of these things can be repeated, and you can even take in a tree pose variation, again, the block squeezed towards the back of the thigh and at the ankle, and come into holding it like this, because if the aim for something like a tree pose is to open the glute, then that makes sense. If the focus is just primarily on the balance and you don't want to concern yourself with what's going on there, well then you can just do a balancing pose like this. No need to push and force and shove the body into this type of position, because again, as we've discussed, we know that this does not have a very positive impact on the tendons and the ligaments over time. Let's take a quick look at a side lunge. Now, just depending on what's happening with your students, they might decide that they want to go all the way down. I know for me, I cannot come up if I go all the way down, but there are some students I know that definitely can go all the way down and come all the way up. But if we're looking at making this pose more sustainable and specifically related to this glute, there are two things that you can get them to focus on. One is keeping the weight more towards the outer edge of this foot as they come down. This foot, we're not going to talk about this leg too much because that's groin and that's in the next one, but keeping the weight more on the outer edge, because that creates the wrapping for this glute to strengthen, but also lengthen in some capacity, but also for your students to not go super low into their range. Most of these things are not super functional ranges of motion. So I would say that your students would really benefit from you cueing them to try to stay a little bit more lifted. So even if they can go all the way down, getting them to resist, maybe not even going very much lower than that parallel position where the knee and the crotch are on the same level. Maybe they're going a tiny bit lower than that, but not too much more. Now this isn't super focused on that glute, but if the body does then come forward, right, then we're getting more of that external rotation. So these are just some little things that you can use that, again, they're not super related to glute, but it is involved in some capacity that you can play around with for that side lunge. Now the last thing that we're going to quickly look at in the glute focus poses for single leg is our twisted lunge, whether it's here or we're coming into this type of thing. And you know where I'm going to go? Hands free. If your students are not able to get themselves into a position of twist or hold themselves here without forcing their body with the hand on the floor or the hand on a block or the elbow on the leg, well, you know where I'm going with this. It's just not a very sustainable approach. It's not a very invitational or welcomed approach into the body. And if they do want to do those things, in the very least, you're helping them create more invitation, more sustainability, and a more welcomed approach by encouraging them to go hands-free, maybe leading into the force, but when they come out of it, again, stabilizing. So if they are here in something like this, get them to first come off, and then hover, and then they can come out of it in that way. All of these things can be used to help one another, and they do not have to be used just separately or in isolation, but as you cue your classes and as you sequence your classes, you'll see where these things can be built and stacked one on top of the other to help your students progress towards doing poses that are either maybe a little bit more demanding, or again, if sustainability is the name of the game for you, just creating the lengthening of the tissues via the action and the strength and stability the body naturally will engage in.